By the time Odette Harrow was led beneath the glass vault of the daylight court, she already understood that humiliation could be prepared like a ceremonial room. It had been arranged in silver and white stone, in banners dark as dried blood, in ranks of nobility standing without breath beneath the filtered sun. The high panes above were stained with crimson mineral, so the light entered was softened and holy-looking, harmless to the ancient ones and cruel to everyone else. It painted the floor in the color of old wounds. Odette walked through it alone. 3 winters had passed since House Harrow had given her to the Knight Crown as the living pledge of peace. 3 winters in the king's palace, lodged in rooms finer than any she had known as a girl and lonelier than a grave. She had been dressed, instructed, displayed, then quietly forgotten. Not one promise had ever been spoken plainly to her, but the court had made its own shape of silence. It had named her almost bride, discarded bride, pet hostage, future queen, and at times, when the older vampires looked at her too long, sacrifice. At the far end of the chamber sat King Severin Thorne. He wore black velvet without ornament, as if jewels would have been an insult to the authority already resting in his stillness. He did not move when she entered. He did not even seem to breathe. Yet the whole court bent around his silence as reeds bent around a submerged stone. His beauty was not the sort that invited admiration. It was colder than that, too severe, too patient, touched by centuries and by some sorrow that had hardened instead of healing. Odette kept her gaze lowered until custom allowed otherwise. When she looked up, he was already looking at her. It lasted only an instant. Then the Chancellor of the Vale rose and said, "By request of the Covenant Houses, this matter shall be settled in daylight, before witness and law. The mortal Lady Odette Harrow has resided within the king's walls beyond the customary term. Rumor has become disruption. We ask our sovereign to speak plainly." A murmur moved through the chamber like silk over bone. Odette felt every eye on her. Her hands tightened beneath her sleeves. The Chancellor turned toward the throne. "Does the crown intend to bind this mortal to the royal line?" No one breathed. Even the servants along the walls went still. Severin's face did not alter. Odette had never expected tenderness from him. She had schooled herself against that folly in her first months at court, when every accidental kindness had seemed like the beginning of recognition. A book was sent to her room because he had once heard her speak of poetry. A physician summoned when winter fever took her. A black cloak left draped over a chapel pew after she had shivered there alone. He had never claimed those acts. He had never claimed anything. Still, some small and hidden part of her had not prepared for what came next. "No," said the Vampire King. The word fell cleanly. The court waited, greedy for more. Severin gave it to them. "She is not of my blood, not of my line, and not under the promise of royal bond. Her presence here has been a political necessity, nothing more." The filtered daylight seemed to sharpen. Odette thought, absurdly, that she had heard the sound of glass cracking somewhere high above, though the vault remained whole. Political necessity, nothing more. Something in her chest tightened with such force that she feared it would show on her face. But Odette Harrow had spent 3 winters surviving by not displaying pain to those who found nourishment in it. She dipped her head with formal obedience and let the court look its fill. A noblewoman in amber silk smiled behind her fan. Lord Malric, whose eyes always lingered too long, inclined his head as if congratulating himself. Someone whispered, "At last!" The Chancellor bowed. "Then let all hear it. The crown renounces personal claim." Odette felt the words strike her like cold water. The audience ended soon after, though she remembered almost none of it. She remembered only the sensation of crossing the chamber, as if her body had become something carried from a distance. She remembered Severin never once looking back at her. By dusk, the palace had learned the shape of her disgrace. Servants grew soft-voiced in corridors. The doors did not open as quickly. One maid wept while fastening the hooks of Odette's gown, and was dismissed because Odette could not bear to be pitied. Near evening, she escaped the rooms assigned to her and made her way to the old cloister garden beneath the western battlements, where dead roses clung to iron trellises like remnants of a fire. The sky was turning from ash to violet. The first bell of night had not yet sounded. She stood beside a dry fountain and pressed one hand over her mouth until the tremor passed. He had denied her before the whole court, not refused a marriage, not corrected rumor, denied her. The distinction cut deeper because it had dignity in it. It had been spoken with kingly restraint, as if her heart were beneath notice. Odette closed her eyes and forced herself not to cry. Her mother had once told her that grief, when watched, became another sort of humiliation. Leaves crackled behind her. She turned, expecting a servant. Instead, she saw two figures in the livery of palace guards, though neither wore the king's silver sigil. One smiled. "Her protection has fallen," he said. Odette stepped back. "You are not assigned to this wing." The other drew a blade as pale as bone. Its edge shone with a powder she knew enough to fear. Silver ash, something made to wound even the deathless. Fear moved through her in one clean wave, stripping thought. She turned and ran. The garden paths were crooked with shadow. Her skirts caught on thorn. Behind her boots struck stone, measured, unhurried, confident. They had known she would be alone. They had known the denial would leave her unguarded. A gloved hand seized her wrist. She cried out and twisted, but the knife flashed toward her ribs and stopped. Not in mercy, in a hand that closed around the attacker's throat. King Severin had appeared so silently that for one impossible instant he seemed not to have crossed the space at all. He simply was there, black-clad, pale-eyed, terrible. The guard's body lifted from the ground as if weight had ceased to matter. The second man lunged. Severin did not look at him. He extended one hand, and the attacker struck some unseen boundary in the air, as though night itself had become a wall. Then the king moved. A blur, a crack of bone, silence. The first guard made a wet, choking sound. Severin's expression did not alter as he broke the man's neck. Odette stood frozen beside the dead fountain, one hand pressed to the thorn-slashed skin of her forearm. Blood slid bright across her wrist. Severin turned at last. In the deepening dark, his face seemed carved from winter. But his eyes, those ancient, unreadable eyes, fell to the blood on her skin, and something fierce and involuntary flashed across them before vanishing. "You are hurt," he said. It was not a concern. It was something lower, rougher, more dangerous for being restrained. Odette drew back. "You told them I was nothing more than a necessity." A silence opened between them. The 9th bell had not yet rung. The moon had not yet risen. In the ruined garden, with two bodies cooling among the thorns, Severin took one step toward her. "I told them what would keep you alive until night," he said. Then he looked beyond her, toward the palace windows burning gold in the dusk. And for the first time in 3 years, fear touched the king's voice. "Come with me now, Odette. Before midnight they will try again." He did not take her through the palace. That frightened her more than the dead men had. Severin led her instead through a postern door hidden behind the western chapel, down a stair swallowed by damp stone and darkness, into the oldest marrow of the citadel. Odette followed because the alternative was to remain above, where someone inside the court had arranged her death with exquisite timing. Her hand throbbed where the thorn had torn it. She could feel the blood drying on her skin beneath her sleeve. The king carried no lamp. He did not need one. He moved through the black passages with the certainty of a creature walking his own pulse. When the stair narrowed, his hand rose once, palm back toward her, a wordless warning to mind the drop. He never touched her. At the bottom lay a chapel long abandoned by human priests and too old for vampire worship. Its vaulted ceiling had partially collapsed, and moonlight entered through the wound in silver bars. One altar remained, veiled in dust. Someone had kept this place from total ruin. A fire had been laid recently in the grate. A wool blanket rested across a carved bench. A physician's chest stood against the wall. Odette looked from the blanket to the bandages to him. "You expected this." "No," Severin said. "I feared it." The distinction did nothing to quiet the unrest in her chest. He opened the physician's chest and withdrew a basin, clean cloth, and a small glass vial. "Sit." The command was soft, which made it somehow harder to resist. Odette crossed to the bench and sat with careful dignity. He knelt before her only because her injured arm forced the angle. The sight of a king kneeling should have eased something in her. It did not. He was too composed, too terrible even at her feet. His head bent over her wrist, shadowing the sharp line of his cheek. He poured water over the cut, and the sting made her inhale. His hands were gloved. "Why deny me before the court?" she asked, keeping her gaze fixed on the far wall, "if your purpose was protection. Because had I claimed you in daylight, Lord Malrec would have invoked trial by covenant before sunset. I was already tired." "No," Severin said. "You were humiliated. Had I done otherwise, you would have been condemned." That should have sounded like an explanation. Instead, it sounded like a sentence passed from some height beyond appeal. Odette looked down at him then. "You had 3 years to warn me." He tied the bandage with immaculate care. "I had 3 years to keep the law from noticing you. By forgetting me." At last something changed in his face. It was small, a tightening at the mouth, a stillness sharpened into pain. "But it was there. You think neglect is always indifference," he said. She gave a faint, disbelieving laugh. "What else should I call it?" He rose, every motion spare and controlled. "Call it strategy." The answer was so cold that it reopened the wound inside her more surely than any blade. She stood too quickly, anger lending strength to shame. "Then your strategy was perfect, Your Majesty. They believed you." Moonlight spilled across the ruined altar between them. Beyond the broken arch, the castle bells began to toll the 11th hour. Severin turned toward the sound, listening with attention so fine it was nearly invisible. "You cannot remain in your chambers," he said. "Not tonight. I will not remain here either." His gaze returned to her. "You will." She had not realized until then how much of his authority lived in silence rather than raised voice. The room seemed to narrow around it. Odette pressed one hand to the bench behind her, steadying herself. "Am I a prisoner now? You have always been in danger," he said. "Tonight is simply the first time you have seen it." Before she could answer, a draft moved through the chapel. The flames in the grate bent low. Somewhere in the corridor beyond, stone grated against stone. Severin went still, not startled, not uncertain, predatory. He crossed the chapel in a blur, and extinguished the fire with one swift movement of his hand, plunging the room into moon-slashed gloom. Then he was before her, closer than he had ever been in all the years she had known him. She felt the cold of him before anything touched. "Not a sound," he murmured. The words had scarcely left him when the hidden door behind the altar opened. 2 figures entered, cloaked and hooded. Not guards this time. Their gait was too careful, their silence trained. One carried a chain of silver links wound around the wrist. The other held a crossbow no human servant could have smuggled through the inner halls without help. Odette's breath caught. Severin's hand came to rest at the small of her back, not possessive, not tender, only decisive. It was the first time he had ever touched her. Even through layers of cloth, the cold of him burned. "Stay behind me," he said. The hooded stranger with the chain laughed quietly. "So it is true. The king keeps his hidden chapel." "Leave," Severin said. "No," the chain unwound in a bright spill of metal. "Surrender the mortal and the council may yet believe your restraint." Odette stared. The council. Not assassins alone, then. Not some rogue hunger. Something worse. Something sanctioned in whispers and deniable in public. Severin stepped forward once, moving her fully into the shelter of his body. The chapel darkened as if the moon itself had withdrawn from the breach overhead. His voice, when it came, was low enough to seem almost gentle. "You mistake restraint for weakness." What followed happened too quickly for her fear to keep pace. The crossbow fired. Severin caught the bolt in his bare hand, the chain flung wide. It struck his arm and smoked where it touched, but he did not even look at the wound. He seized the first intruder by the face and drove him against the altar hard enough to split stone. The second turned toward Odette in desperate calculation, and met her stare for one instant before Severin crossed the space and put him through the broken shrine window. Silence rushed back, broken only by Odette's breathing. Blood, dark and strangely luminous, ran from the king's hand where the silver bolt had pierced him. A drop struck the chapel floor. Another struck the cuff of Odette's dress. Severin looked at the smear of her blood beneath her bandage, then at his own hand, then at the place where the two had nearly met. His expression changed with frightening suddenness, not into hunger, into recognition. He closed his wounded hand at once, but not before Odette saw the old scar around his wrist flare pale silver beneath the skin, as if some buried mark had awakened. "What is that?" she whispered. The bells began to strike at midnight. Once, twice. Severin lifted his head toward the sound, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked less like a king than a man cornered by fate. "Something," he said, voice gone quiet with dread, "that should have remained sleeping." She did not sleep. Even after the 12th bell had faded, and the dead intruders had been removed by creatures who came only at the king's silent summons and vanished before she could study them, sleep would not come. Odette sat wrapped in the wool blanket, listening to the old chapel breathe in stone creaks and winter drafts. Severin remained awake across from her, in a carved chair that might once have belonged to a bishop. Dawn would have driven lesser vampires to shelter, but the royal line could endure the diluted light of morning behind bloodless and within deep halls. Still, he looked like something made for night alone. He had changed his gloves. The wound from the silver bolt was hidden. The revelation was not. Between them lay an unease thicker than secrecy. At last, when the chapel's narrow high window had gone from black to a bruised indigo, Odette said, "You owe me truth." Severin's gaze remained fixed on the dying embers in the grate. "I owe you far more than the truth. Then begin there." A pause, then he rose. "Come with me." He took her not upward, but sideways through another concealed passage leading out from the chapel into a cloister open to the sky. There, to her astonishment, lay a garden sealed inside the oldest ring of the palace. Black lilies, winter rosemary. Pale thorn roses cultivated among tombstones, so ancient their inscriptions had weathered nearly smooth. It was beautiful in the way ruins could be beautiful, tended, haunted, stubbornly alive. The dawn light here was gentler, filtered by stone arches and red glass overhead. In the center stood a statue of a veiled woman. Odette stopped as if some instinct had caught her by the throat. The carved face was idealized, but the turn of it, the line of the brow, the mouth unsmiling beneath the veil, something about it struck too close. Severin watched her see it. "Who is she?" He did not answer immediately. "The first mortal ever meant to wear the crown beside my line." Odette approached the statue. At its base, beneath a drift of ivy, she found the inscription, "Serilda Vale, beloved of the night throne, burned in covenant year 147 Vale." Her mother's mother had been a Vale. A chill passed through her that had nothing to do with the mourning. "She was my kin. Your blood descends from hers." Odette turned slowly. "Why was I never told this?" "Because dead queens are dangerous things to remember." The quiet with which he said it was more terrible than bitterness would have been. He came no closer than propriety demanded, yet the space between them had changed since midnight. It held not distance now, but strain. "In the centuries after Serilda's death," he said, "the covenant houses forbade royal union with mortals. They called it protection of the realm. They meant protection of their own power. A king may feed from mortals, rule mortals, bury mortals, but never raise one beside him. That law was built on her ashes." Odette looked again at the carved face. "A woman loved enough to be given a statue, feared enough to be erased from memory. And me? You were sent here as treaty collateral because House Harrow's blood sealed the old peace." He paused. "I recognized your lineage at once." Something tightened painfully inside her. "So you kept me near because I resembled a dead woman." "No." The force in that single word made her lift her head. Severin stood motionless beneath the arch, but his stillness no longer resembled calm. It resembled control under pressure. "I kept you near because the same blood that once nearly broke this kingdom flows in you, and others would have used it if I had not." She thought of the court, the knives, the chain. Shame gave way slowly to something more lucid and more dangerous: comprehension. "You denied me so they could not accuse you of reviving her." "Yes, Yet they came for me anyway. Yes, then your strategy failed. A shadow passed through his gaze, brief, but unmistakably self-directed. It did. The admission stunned her more than any excuse might have done. They stood in the Garden of the Dead while dawn bled slowly through the red glass above. Somewhere beyond the walls, the palace was waking into its rigid order, unaware that beneath its foundations old names were stirring. Odette's hand went to the bandage at her wrist. What woke last night? Severin looked at the statue rather than at her. An old ritual. Those 3 words fell into the silence like iron keys. What ritual? He was silent so long she thought he would refuse. Then he said, a soul binding once devised to allow a mortal consort to survive the blood of the throne. The air thinned around her. That is impossible. It was forbidden, not impossible. Her heart beat hard against her ribs. And it has something to do with me. With your blood, he said. And mine. Odette stepped back from the statue. No. That one syllable held fear, disbelief, and a grief she had not expected to feel, not because she loved him. She had taught herself not to call longing by such a dangerous name, but because fate, once spoken aloud, reduced every previous sorrow to rehearsal. Severin seemed to hear all of that and answer none of it. The ritual was never completed in Seralda's time. It should have died with her, but it did not. No, his gaze lifted at last to hers. Something in the chapel recognized you. Odette thought of the flare beneath his skin, the silver scar igniting, the terrible look in his eyes when her blood and his came near each other. Can it be stopped? She asked. A bell sounded faintly overhead. Morning council. Severin's face became unreadable again. Perhaps. That frightened her more than certainty would have. He turned and crossed toward one of the tombs, where a narrow iron gate stood half-hidden in vines. From within his coat, he drew a small key of black metal and fitted it to the lock. The gate opened on a recess in the wall, a burial niche or a shrine. Inside hung a portrait. Odette stared. The painted woman wore mourning blue, one hand resting on a stone balustrade, the other over her heart. Her face was not identical to Odette's. It was older, prouder, sorrow-tempered. But the likeness was unmistakable enough that Odette felt the world tilt under her feet. At the bottom of the frame, in faded script, were the words. Seralda, on the eve of binding Odette, heard her own voice as if from far away. Why bring me here? Severin's answer was almost inaudible. Because last night when you bled, the portrait opened. She looked again. Behind the frame, where canvas and wall no longer sat flush, a dark seam gaped like a mouth in stone. Something hidden for centuries was waiting behind the dead queen's face. The chamber behind the portrait was narrow and dry, lined in cedar blackened by age. No jewels glittered there, no crown, no treasure fit for legend. Instead, the hidden room held relics of a more dangerous sort. Letters bound in faded silk, a prayer book swollen by old damp, a small bridal circlet tarnished almost black. And on a low pedestal of white marble, a shallow silver bowl chased with thornvine patterns. Odette knew what it was before Severin spoke. The binding vessel, he said. She did not cross the threshold. The room seemed to contain not air but memory itself, compressed and waiting. Even Severin entered it with restraint, as though any careless motion might wake the wrong century. He lifted one of the letters but did not open it. The light across his hands showed how rigidly he held them. She wrote until the night she died, he said. Odette looked at the letters. To you, yes. Did you keep them hidden? No, his mouth hardened. They were hidden from me. She understood then what the place truly was, not a shrine built in reverence, but a vault made by conspirators. A place where truth had been buried beside the body that might have undone the law built upon its ruin. Lord Malric knows of this, she asked. He suspects there are records I have not destroyed. Destroyed? The word told her how often that had been demanded. Severin set the letter down and reached for the silver bowl. The metal had dulled with age, but when his fingers neared it, faint lines etched along the rim gave a muted gleam, as though responding to blood older than kingdoms. Odette should have been afraid of it. Instead, she felt a terrible pull, not desire exactly, but recognition without reason. She stepped forward at last. "Do not touch it," Severin said. The warning came too late. Her bandaged wrist had loosened while climbing through the narrow seam behind the portrait. A corner of linen caught on splintered wood, tearing free. The half-healed scratch reopened. One bright drop fell from her skin into the bowl. The chamber changed. It did not darken, it deepened. Odette heard a sound like distant singing cut off by wind. The silver along the rim blazed white. Severin moved at once, but not quickly enough to stop what rose between them. A vision seized her. She was no longer standing in the cedar shadow. She was in the ruined chapel, only it was whole. Candles crowding the altar, white flowers at the steps, moonlight pouring through unbroken glass. A woman in bridal blue stood before the altar with trembling hands. Seralda, not painted now, but alive, breath unsteady, eyes bright with terror and love. Across from her stood a younger Severin, though even then he wore age like a second nature. He looked less hard, less exhausted by survival. His gaze on Seralda was so openly reverent it made Odette's chest ache. Their hands lifted over the silver bowl. Blood fell. The candles blew out all at once. Then shouting, doors breaking, men in covenant red storming the chapel with silver and fire. Seralda turned, not to flee, but to shield the bowl with her body. Severin roared with a grief too large to fit in human sound. Flames, smoke. A hand dragging Seralda away by the throat while she cried one word that Odette felt, rather than heard. Finish, the vision shattered. Odette staggered back into the hidden chamber with a cry. Strong hands caught her shoulders before she hit the wall. Severin, his face was inches from hers, too close, too stark. Whatever he had seen through the shared vision had stripped him of control more thoroughly than she would once have believed possible. His eyes were black at the center, shot through with silver light. "You saw it," he said. She could barely breathe. "They killed her. Yes, she told you to finish it." His grip tightened once, then eased as if by force. "I could not," Odette's pulse hammered. "Because she died. Because they burned the law into the kingdom before I could bury the dead." He released her, as though touch itself had become dangerous. She noticed then that in catching her he had torn his glove. The skin at his wrist lay bare. Around it blazed a silver mark, not a scar after all, but the half-circle of an unfinished bond. Odette stared. He saw where her gaze had fallen, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the blood on her reopened wrist slid down over her hand. One crimson thread. His eyes tracked it with a hunger so swift and involuntary that she felt it like heat across her skin. Not lust, not cruelty, something older and more sacred for being feared. Severin turned away at once, jaw hard. "I should not have brought you here," he said. "But you did." "Yes. Why?" At last he faced her again, and whatever answer might have been easiest died before it reached his mouth. "Because after last night," he said quietly, "I could no longer bear not knowing whether the dead had chosen you." The honesty of it struck her silent. Outside, somewhere above the stone, a bell rang the hour. Time resumed its movement, but the room felt permanently altered. Odette wrapped her fingers around her bleeding wrist. "What happens now?" Severin looked at the silver bowl, then at the letters, then at her. "Now the court will notice what has awakened." As if called by the words, footsteps sounded beyond the garden wall, distant, purposeful, not servants, messengers. Severin crossed the threshold in 2 long strides and closed the portrait over the hidden chamber with a force that rattled the hinges. When he turned back, the king had returned to his face, but not wholly. Something raw still lived beneath it. "You must go to your rooms," he said. "And pretend nothing has changed. Can you?" Odette thought of Seralda's last cry, of his hands on her shoulders, of the unfinished silver mark burning at his wrist. "No, then pretend for 1 hour." He moved toward the archway, already listening to the footsteps nearing the garden. "Long enough for me to learn which enemy has become bold." She caught his sleeve before she could think better of it. The contact lasted only an instant. Yet the moment her fingers closed over black velvet, a shock of cold went through her so sharply she gasped. Severin froze. Odette pulled back at once, but too late. Across the inside of her own wrist, beneath the torn bandage, a pale crescent had appeared in her skin like moonlight trapped under flesh. Severin saw it. And in a voice emptied of all denial, he said, "God help us." The mark did not fade. Odette hid it beneath silk and lace, beneath composure, beneath every small discipline that had kept her intact through 3 years of ceremonial loneliness. But by evening she still felt it there, cool, faintly luminous, a crescent burned into the skin above her pulse. It did not pain her. That would have been easier to endure. Instead, it seemed to listen. The palace had shifted around her. Not visibly. The chandeliers still blazed. The black-liveried attendants still moved with choreographed silence through the evening galleries. Music still floated from the Hall of Veils, where lesser nobles pretended appetite for art was nobler than appetite for blood. Yet something underneath the surface order had tightened. Too many conversations ceased when she entered. Too many eyes dropped to her hands. News traveled among the deathless with indecent speed. She was summoned at moonrise, not to the public court, but to the archive tower adjoining the king's private library. Severin waited there alone. Odette had never been admitted to this part of the palace. Shelves climbed into darkness, filled with manuscripts bound in hide and vellum, maps painted on skin-thin parchment, ledgers older than empires. Tall windows of black glass admitted no outside gaze. In the center of the room burned a fire with no warmth. Severin stood beside a table on which several letters had been laid open. "You brought them from the chamber," she said. "Yes, you trust me with them." He looked at her in that unnerving, unwavering way of his. "I have run out of safer choices." He handed her the uppermost page. The script was a woman's, elegant and hurried. "If he tells you I was weak, know it is a lie. If he tells you I bewitched the prince, know it is because he cannot admit that men who worship law will always fear a love they cannot govern." Odette read in silence, while the fire hissed softly behind her. Seralda's letters were not love poems. They were records of secret meetings interrupted by council decrees, of petitions denied, of plans to complete the soul binding in a chapel guarded by loyalists, of suspicion falling upon a covenant lord named Malhervé. The name stirred something. Malrec bore the same cold mouth, the same thin arrogance in miniature. "His line," Odette whispered. Severin inclined his head. "Malrec descends from the man who betrayed her. Then why is he not dust?" A shadow crossed the king's face. "Because kingdoms are easier to avenge than courts." The answer held a weariness vast enough to humble outrage. Odette set the letter down carefully. "He wants me dead because the bond proves the old law false. It proves the law was built on murder. And if the court learns that, it will divide." His voice was calm, only his hands were not. One rested flat against the edge of the table, as if restraining some deeper violence. "Some will prefer the old lie." She looked toward him fully then. "And you?" Something in his expression made the library seem suddenly smaller, darker. "I preferred your safety to my vindication." The words entered her with quiet force. She did not know what to do with them. They did not erase daylight or humiliation or the winters of silence, but they rearranged them. "And if my safety is no longer possible?" Severin's gaze lowered briefly to the hidden place of the mark beneath her cuff, as if he could see through silk. "Then I will have to choose differently." A knock sounded, too soft to be innocent. Both turned. Lady Myrle entered carrying a silver tray with a carafe of dark wine. She had served Odette since her first year in the palace, had brushed out her hair on lonely evenings, and spoken of unimportant things in a voice kind enough to soothe. Seeing her there ought to have comforted Odette. Instead, a subtle dread moved through her. Myrle did not meet her eyes. "Your Majesty," she said with lowered head, "Lord Malrec requests an audience at the lower court. He says the delay becomes suspicious." Severin's face gave nothing away. "Tell him suspicion is a nobleman's preferred pastime." Myrle bowed, but as she turned to go, the tray tilted, only slightly. Enough for the wine to spill in a dark thread over the table and across the open letter. Odette moved instinctively to save it. Myrle's hand shot out, not to help, but to catch Odette's wrist. The marked one, The contact sent a burst of pain through Odette's arm like silver driven into bone. She cried out. The sleeve fell back. The crescent mark flashed pale in the library gloom. Myrtle stared at it with naked fear. Then, before Odette or the king could speak, the maid snatched a small whistle from her bodice and blew a single shrill note. The tower doors slammed open. Men in covenant black flooded the threshold with drawn silver. Lady Myrtle stumbled backward, weeping already. "Forgive me," she whispered to Odette. "He has my brother." Severin moved. Odette never afterwards remembered the first moments clearly, only fragments. The king crossing the room with supernatural speed, candles guttering out as if night followed him in obedience. One attacker hurled into a shelf, so hard that books burst around him like dark birds. Silver flashed, someone screamed. Myrtle dropped to the floor with her hands over her ears. "Behind me," Severin said. Odette had heard those words before, but never with such fury beneath them. A blade cut the air toward his shoulder. He took it there rather than let it reach her. The smell of burned cloth rose sharp and metallic. He did not falter. The attacker's throat broke in his grip. More footsteps thundered on the stair below. Too many. Severin seized Odette by the waist and lifted her onto the library table as if she weighed nothing. With his other hand he tore aside a hanging map, revealing a narrow iron door hidden in the wall. "Inside," he said. "What about you?" "Inside, Odette." This time she obeyed. The passage beyond was scarcely wider than her shoulders. It smelled of dust and old mortar. As she backed into it, Severin's eyes met hers, dark, blazing, no longer remotely courtly. "Whatever you hear," he said, "do not come out until I call your name." Then the iron door began to swing shut. Before darkness closed, Odette heard Lord Malric's voice from the library threshold, smooth with triumph. "Your Majesty," he said, "shall we finally speak of the mortal you do not claim?" The passage was airless and black. Odette pressed one hand over her mouth and listened. At first there was only confusion beyond the iron door. Bootsteps, the crash of something heavy overturned, the brittle rain of shattered glass. Then came silence, so abrupt it was worse than any struggle. The palace had taught her that true power often sounded like nothing at all. She did not know how long she waited. Long enough for the candles' smell to die, long enough for fear to grow teeth. At last she heard her name, not shouted. "Odette!" She opened the door. The library looked like a battlefield remembered by a church. Blood stained the carpet in black arcs. 2 bodies lay still beside the far shelves. Myrtle had been removed. Whether rescued or taken, Odette could not tell. Lord Malric was gone. Severin stood at the central table, one hand braced against its edge, the other pressed hard over the wound in his shoulder, where silver had burned through cloth and flesh. He was breathing, though shallowly. She had never seen him diminished before. The sight struck her with such force that she forgot caution and crossed to him at once. "You are hurt." His eyes lifted to hers, and the look in them halted her one step away, not because it was cruel, because it was unguarded. There are moments when restraint becomes more intimate than touch. Odette felt that truth then with frightening clarity. His control was fraying, not into savagery, but into need so carefully resisted that it made her pulse quicken in sheer human alarm. "You should not be this near me," he said. "Because of the mark, because you are bleeding." Only then did she realize a splinter or blade had cut her palm while she hid in the passage. Not much. Only enough for one bright line to cross the center of her hand. Yet his gaze had found it instantly. Odette swallowed. "Then look elsewhere." A strange, almost broken sound escaped him. It might once, in a more human throat, have been laughter. "You ask much of me tonight." He turned away as if to reclaim distance, and the movement unsealed the wound at his shoulder. Dark blood welled. Instinct overruled fear. Odette reached for the linen fallen from the physician's chest and stepped beside him. "Sit." His head turned fractionally. It would have been easy for him to refuse, easier still to command her back. Instead, after a long moment, he lowered himself into the chair she drew from the hearth, with all the rigid reluctance of a sovereign submitting to something more dangerous than battle. Odette cut away the burned fabric. The wound beneath made her stomach tighten. Silver had left its bright cruelty in a ragged line, one no ordinary medicine could soothe. She cleaned it with careful hands. Severin did not flinch, but his fingers tightened on the arm of the chair when her sleeve slipped and the crescent mark flashed again between them. "What did Malrek want?" she asked quietly, more to steady herself than from hope of answer. "You," she tied the bandage. "Alive, for the trial, yes." After that, it would have depended on the court's appetite for old spectacles. Odette's throat tightened. "Burning," his silence answered. The library dimmed around them. Somewhere below, bells began to toll an emergency summons through the lower halls. Malrek was gathering allies openly now. Denial had failed. Secrecy had failed. The kingdom was turning its hidden gears toward judgment. Odette set aside the stained cloth. "Then tell me all of it. No more fractions." Severin's gaze remained on the fireless grate. When he spoke, his voice was low enough to seem meant for the dark rather than for her. The soul binding was devised for one purpose only: to allow a mortal to share the royal blood without losing herself to it. The king and consort exchanged blood within the vessel, and the bond reshaped both lives around a single vow. Not ownership, not enthrallment. A covenant, and Seralda was to become the first lawful bridge between human and immortal rule. Instead she died. "Yes," Odette watched the line of his face. "And you have spent centuries obeying the law that killed her." "No," for the first time bitterness edged his voice. "I have spent centuries waiting for a way to break it without feeding another woman to its fire." The words settled over her with terrible gentleness. All at once the 3 silent winters took on a new shape. Not indifference, not contempt, a vigil. "You kept away from me," she said slowly, "because you feared the bond would wake." He closed his eyes briefly. "I feared I would." Something in her chest ached then, not with triumph, for none was possible in such sorrow, but with understanding so tender it was almost unbearable. He rose suddenly, as if remaining seated before her had become intolerable. "I should take you from the palace before dawn," he said. "There is an old fortress north of the river. Few know it belongs to the crown. And run, if necessary." Odette stared. "You would abandon your court for me." A long pause. Then, too honest now to retreat, he said, "I would abandon much more." The bells below ceased. In the thick silence that followed came a knock, not at the outer doors, but from within the walls themselves. A hidden messenger route. Severin crossed to the panel and opened it. A pale page knelt outside, trembling visibly. "My king," the boy said, unable to raise his eyes, "the Covenant houses have assembled beneath the black glass. Lord Malrek invokes an immediate tribunal. He accuses the mortal lady of unlawful enchantment and blood treason." Odette felt the room narrow. Severin asked only, "At what hour?" "Sunset tomorrow." The boy dared one glance upward, then blanched as if whatever he saw in the king's face would haunt him forever. When the panel closed again, Odette knew before he turned that something irreversible had shifted. He looked at her, and the old distance was gone at last. "They mean to try you," he said. Odette's fingers went to the hidden crescent at her wrist. "And if they convict?" Severin's answer came with the quiet certainty of an oath spoken over a grave. "Then the court will learn what it costs to take you from me." The Hall of Judgment had been built to make mercy look impossible. Its ceiling rose in a dome of black glass veined with crimson, so that the dusk filtering through it seemed less like light than congealed blood. Thrones for the Covenant lords ringed the central floor, in a half-circle of carved obsidian. At the center stood a white stone dais marked with old sigils, where the accused were made to stand alone beneath every gaze. Odette had never before entered that hall. She did so now in black silk, with no jewels and no veil, as though the court meant to strip her of the ceremony. The crescent mark burned cool beneath the lace at her wrist. She kept her hands folded before her and her chin level, though every instinct urged retreat. To fear privately was still permitted. To break in public would only feed them. Above the dais, King Severin sat upon the night throne in absolute stillness. He wore the crown now, a narrow circlet of dark metal set with no gem, only a single shard of old moonstone at the brow. It made him look less adorned than burdened. No trace of the previous night's wound showed upon him. No trace, either, of what he had said in the library. "The court will learn what it costs to take you from me." Only his eyes betrayed it, and only to someone who had learned how much he concealed inside silence. Lord Malrek rose from his appointed seat below the throne. He was lovely in the polished manner of poisonous things, silver-haired, elegant, smooth-voiced, with the same old arrogance that had echoed through Seralda's letters. When he bowed, the gesture managed to look like an insult. "My king," he said, "we gather under covenant law to address a matter of blood treason, unlawful enchantment, and corruption of the royal line." A murmur moved through the hall. Odette did not look at Severin. Malrek turned toward her with the ease of a man already savoring a verdict. The mortal Lady Odette Harrow entered this court under treaty protection. Yet in recent nights a forbidden royal sign has appeared upon her flesh, accompanied by violence, concealment, and the sudden death of loyal servants. At that, Lady Myrtle was brought forward. Odette's heart lurched. The maid was pale, her face swollen from weeping, but alive. A chain of silver lay at her throat, not enough to kill, only enough to command obedience. Malrek smiled faintly. "Let the witness speak." Myrtle's hands shook. She looked once toward Odette, and shame passed nakedly over her face. "I carried wine to the archive tower at Lord Malrek's order," she whispered. "He said only to confirm whether the lady bore a mark. He said my brother would die if I refused. Did you see the mark?" "Yes." A deeper murmur. Someone hissed a prayer against heresy. Malrek's voice sharpened. "And what else did you see?" Myrtle's mouth trembled. "The king protecting her." That silence was colder than uproar. Malrek turned slowly to the throne. "Your Majesty, yesterday in daylight you denied personal claim over this mortal. Yet by night you concealed her, killed her, and hid relics tied to the outlawed binding of Seralda Vale." Odette felt the court shift like a blade being tested in the hand. Severin did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was so calm it made men lean closer to hear it. "Choose your next accusation carefully, Malrek." The warning only made the Lord smile. "Gladly." "I accuse the Crown of intent to revive a mortal consort through a forbidden blood rite." A dozen nobles rose at once, shouting over one another, some in outrage, others in triumphant delight. The hall's restraint broke open into panic. Odette stood in the center of it and suddenly understood what Seralda had faced, not a lawful court, but terror dressed in ceremony. The law did not fear wickedness. It feared change. A silver staff struck the floor 3 times. Chancellor Valen demanded an order. "Let the accused speak," he intoned. All eyes turned to Odette. She had not been prepared to defend herself. Severin had prepared for flight, for concealment, for war if needed, but not for this theater of sanctioned cruelty. Yet as she stood beneath the blood-dark dome, she discovered something steadier than courage. Exhaustion, not a weakness, clarity. She lifted her gaze to the ring of covenant lords. "I did not seek your king," she said. Her voice carried farther than she expected. "I did not ask for your bond, your fear, or your old ghosts. For 3 years I was silent, because silence was all this court permitted me. If a mark now appears upon my flesh, it is not because I bewitched a throne. It is because your history is lying in this room." The hall stirred. Malrek's face sharpened. "Careful, mortal." "No," Odette said softly and turned toward him. "You be careful. Your ancestor murdered Seralda Vale and buried the proof beneath prayers and law. You call me corruption because the dead have begun to answer." For one brilliant second, shock held the chamber still. Then Malrek laughed. "Bold words from prey." He lifted one hand. The silver chain at Myrtle's throat tightened. The maid gave a strangled cry and fell to her knees. Odette moved before she thought. "So this is your law," she said, the words breaking from her with sudden force. "A servant threatened, a witness collared, a woman burned, so men like you may call yourselves guardians." Malrek's composure flickered. "Seize her." Guards advanced from both sides of the dais. Severin rose. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The air in the hall seemed to darken around the throne. No one touches her. The words landed with the weight of an execution order. Some stopped. Others, loyal to Malrek, kept moving. Odette saw the instant choice leave the realm of argument and enter something older. Severin descended the steps of the throne. Every motion was slow, deliberate, terrible. Malrek lifted his chin. "Will you defend treason before the whole cove?" Severin reached the dais. His gaze went first to Myril gasping beneath the chain. Then to the guards closing around Odette. Then, at last, to Malrek. "You wish the court to witness my intention," he said. The silence that followed felt like the held breath before a storm breaks over water. Severin took Odette's hand, not covertly, not in haste. Before the entire Covenant court, he drew back the lace concealing her wrist and revealed the pale crescent to every watching noble. Then, with his bare thumb, he bared the answering half-mark at his own wrist and pressed the two together. A shock of silver light flashed through the hall. The old sigils beneath the dais ignited. Gasps broke into cries. Myril's chain snapped apart as if some hidden force had struck it. Malrek himself staggered back, one hand shielding his eyes. Odette felt the contact like winter and fire united. No pain, only a vast opening, as if some chamber inside her heart had recognized its missing shape. Severin did not release her. "She is under my protection," he said, and for the first time the king's voice held not restraint, but open, ruinous claim. "Let any who dispute it come through me." Then the floor beneath the dais split with a sound like thunder, and from the ancient white stone rose the long-buried silver bowl of binding, answering the join marks with light. Chaos did not erupt all at once. It unfolded in layers. First came the screams from the lesser houses nearest the dais, then the hissed prayers, then the clamor of nobles surging to their feet, while guards drew silver and steel, with no one certain whom they served any longer. The ancient bowl had risen between Odette and Severin like a thing summoned by oath, its silver surface bright with cold inner fire. The old law was no longer a rumor buried in hidden letters. It was awake. Malrek recovered first. "Destroy it," he shouted. 3 guards rushed the dais. Severin moved before their next breath. One struck the stone wall hard enough to crack it. Another lost his weapon and consciousness in the same instant. The third got close enough for silver to flash across the king's side, but no farther. He dropped Severin's hand at his throat. Odette stood amid the wild brightness spilling from the bowl and understood, in a way she never had before, what kingship meant among immortals. Not pageantry, not decree. The court bent first to force, yet Severin did not seem monstrous to her then, only alone. "Back!" Chancellor Valen cried, but half the court had already chosen a side. Some retreated in horror from the awakened relic. Others stared with fascinated dread. A few, very few, looked not at the bowl, but at Odette, as if seeing the shape of a future they had never imagined permissible. Malrek saw those faces too, and his own hardened with urgency. "The bond is incomplete," he shouted. "Kill the mortal and the right collapses." Everything after happened with impossible speed. A crossbow bolt sang down from the western gallery. Severin turned toward it, but Odette had already moved. She did not think. She only saw the line of the shot and the certainty that it had been aimed not at her, but at his unguarded throat. She caught his sleeve with one hand and pulled. The bolt missed his neck. It entered her below the collarbone. The force of it drove her backward. Breath vanished. The sound vanished with it. She felt the cold iron impact, then the delayed bloom of pain like black flowers opening through her chest. Severin caught her before she struck the dais. The hall around them blurred. Odette knew she was on her knees because his arm was behind her shoulders, and his face was suddenly too close, stripped bare of everything royal and distant and composed. His mouth moved. She could not hear what he said at first. Then sound rushed back in fragments, shouting, boots, Malrek calling for the guards to hold formation, the silver bowl singing faintly on the stone. "Odette," Severin's hand was pressed over the wound, though blood slid through his fingers. "Look at me," she did. He looked furious, not at her, at death itself. "I am sorry," she whispered, not even certain why she said it. The expression in his eyes changed with devastating softness. "Do not apologize for saving my life." He snapped the bolt shaft, but did not pull it free. Around them, the court had stopped, all violence bending around the image of their king, cradling a bleeding mortal on the floor of judgment. Malrek descended 2 steps, his voice pitched to carry. "Behold what comes of corruption. The right devours what it touches." Severin did not look up. He laid Odette gently beside the silver bowl and drew a knife from within his coat, small, black-bladed, ceremonial. The sight of it should have frightened her. Instead, she understood somehow before he spoke. "No," she said faintly. His gaze met hers. "It is the only way." The old stories returned in a flash: mortal consort, royal blood, bond reshaping both lives around a vow. He would give her his blood, not as a predator, as a sacrament. Malrek seemed to understand at the same moment. "Stop him!" But those who surged forward met something new in the hall. The sigils around the dais flared. Wind without source tore through the chamber, driving cloaks and banners backward. The old relic answered the half-joined marks and held the nearest attackers at bay in a ring of silver light. Severin cut his own palm. Dark blood welled, rich as garnet in moonlight. Odette's heart stuttered at the scent of it, not because she hungered, but because some deeper part of the awakened bond did. Not appetite, recognition. His hand trembled only once as he lifted the blood to the bowl. "Witness," he said, and though the word was meant for a law older than the court, the whole chamber heard it. Then he brought his bleeding hand to her lips. She turned her face aside, not from fear, from the terrible weight of what acceptance meant. "If I take this," she whispered, fighting for breath, "there is no returning. I know, and for you," a pause. Then, with all the old restraint finally burned away by necessity, he said, "There has been no returning for me since the day you entered my house." The confession entered her more deeply than the blade had. The court vanished, so did fear. Only truth remained between them, late and ruinous and pure. Odette lifted her hand, weak with blood loss, and touched his wrist where the silver half-mark burned. She did not pull him closer, she only answered, "Then do not let it be for nothing." His blood touched her mouth. It was cold first, then unbearably warm, then full of images not her own. Winter battlements under stars. A young king standing over a grave no one must see. 3 years of turning away in corridors, because one glance too long had already become danger. The feel of her presence in the palace like a bell always ringing in rooms he did not enter. Odette gasped. The silver bowl blazed. Her own blood rose from the wound in a thin red thread toward the vessel. He followed. The two met over the shining basin and folded together like silk in water. Malrek cried out, "No!" The light burst outward. When Odette could see again, she was lying against Severin's chest on the dais, the bolt falling harmlessly beside her, the wound at her collarbone close to a silver seam. And across the hall, every pane of black glass above the tribunal had cracked from end to end. The cracked dome held. Jagged lines raced through the black glass overhead like frozen lightning, admitting shafts of moonlight bright enough to wound lesser vampires and expose every face in the hall. No one mistook what had happened. The old rite had not merely awakened, it had accepted them. Odette rose slowly with Severin's help. She felt changed, though not in the monstrous ways the court had always threatened. Her senses were sharper. The pulse of every living heart in the room reached her like distant drums, yet none tempted her. What overwhelmed her instead was the awareness of Severin beside her, not his thoughts, not truly, but the force of his presence, constant now as the tides pull beneath the earth. The bond did not erase her, it made solitude impossible. Malrek saw the dawning comprehension in the hall and struck before it could settle. "Archers!" he shouted. Hidden panels flew open along the upper gallery. Hunters in covenant livery emerged with silver-backed bows, not court guards then, but a reserve prepared long in advance for treason or coup. Their arrows pointed not only at Odette and the king, but at any noble slow to choose a side. So Malrek had not come to try her, he had come to seize the kingdom. "Down!" Severin said. He drew Odette behind the dais as the first volley flew. Silver rang against stone. One arrow struck the throne behind them. Another sank into the arm of Chancellor Valen, who collapsed with a cry. Panic erupted anew. "Traitor!" shouted one of the elder lords. Malrek did not even deny it. "The crown has broken the covenant. Let old blood judge old blood." Several houses moved at once to join him. Others recoiled too late. The hall became a knot of clashing loyalties. Odette crouched behind the dais, her breath thin but steady. The silver seam at her collarbone burned with every movement. She should have been weak. Instead, something inside the bond kept pace with her heartbeat, holding her upright. Severin knelt before her only long enough to cup one hand at the side of her face, not a caress, but near enough to undo her. "You must leave," he said. "No, it is not a request." She looked at him through the tumult and found no king there now, only the terrible man beneath the crown. "If I go, he will say you enthralled me and make my absence his proof. Let him. He will hunt me, not if he is dead before dawn." The starkness of it might once have frightened her. It did not now. It merely revealed how close the kingdom stood to civil ruin. She caught his wrist before he could rise. "If the bond is real, then stop deciding for both of us." For one suspended instant, battle receded. Something in his expression gave way, not authority, but habit. The old instinct to shield her through concealment. Then he inclined his head once. A concession, an acknowledgement. "Very well," he said. "Then stay where I can reach you." He stood and turned toward the hall just as a figure lunged around the dais with a silver pike. Odette saw it first. She seized the fallen ceremonial bowl with both hands and swung it hard into the attacker's temple. The vampire crashed to the floor, stunned. The impact jarred through her arms and sent fresh pain through her healing chest. But Severin's mouth changed, in what might almost have been astonished approval. "That," he said, dispatching the man in one efficient motion, "was reckless." "I know." Another almost smile gone in an instant. Then the lights in the hall extinguished, not all at once. Row by row, candle by candle, as if night itself were entering in obedience to a greater darkness. The remaining moonlight through the cracked dome became the only illumination, silvering smoke and shattered glass. Across the chamber, Malrek stood upon the lower steps of the throne, blood on his sleeve, one hand raised over an opened reliquary. Inside it lay a strip of scorched blue fabric. Seralda's bridal sash. Odette knew it with a certainty that had no source but the bond. Malrek's voice carried through the dark. "He failed her once. He will fail you the same way." At the words, something answered inside Odette's blood. A memory not her own flooded her. Seralda dragged through smoke, Severin fighting toward her too late, the half-finished rite screaming unfinished through flame. Odette staggered, one hand to her temple. Severin was beside her instantly. "What is it?" "The cloth," she breathed. "It remembers." The relic in Malrek's grasp was no trophy. It was proof, preserved through generations as leverage and threat. Malrek smiled across the hall, recognizing from her face that she had seen. "Yes," he said softly. "Ask your king who stood aside while she burned." Severin went utterly still. The bond carried the tremor that passed through him, not guilt alone, but old helpless rage sealed over until it had become part of his bones. Odette turned to him. "Is it true?" His answer came after too long. "I was held," Malrek laughed, "by law, by oath, by every noble in this room who feared what she would become. He chose his throne over your ancestor's life." The accusation struck the chamber with poisonous precision. Some faces looked away. Others stared at Severin with sudden, shamed recognition. Odette searched his face. He did not defend himself. Perhaps because there was no defense against arriving too late. Perhaps because he had judged himself more cruelly than any court could. From above came the shriek of splitting glass. Everyone looked up. The cracked dome was giving way. Moonlight poured harder through widening fractures, and with it, the first cold breath of the night storm gathering over the citadel. Malrek lifted Seralda's burned sash high. "If the old queen could not survive your king's love," he said, looking directly at Odette, "what makes you think you will?" Then the dome shattered. Glass fell like black rain. The hall exploded into motion. Nobles cried out and fled from the open center, while a storm wind tore through the broken dome, extinguishing the last candles and driving moonlight across the floor in savage white sheets. Those rays struck the unshielded vampires hardest. Younger ones shrank back hissing, while the ancients stood their ground through pain and pride alike. Malrek used the chaos well. He flung the burned sash into the storm-dark air and drew a long silver blade from beneath his cloak. "Seal the exits," he shouted. "Take the mortal alive. Kill any who resist." This was no longer tribunal. It was a war. Severin thrust Odette behind the fallen throne steps just as two hunters descended from the gallery. One died before landing. The other turned his blade toward Odette and got no farther than a single step before Chancellor Valan, bleeding, half-risen, but still loyal, drove a spear through his back. "Go," the Chancellor cried. "He means to cut the bond at the source." Odette understood. Malrek would not waste time killing Severin first. He would come for her. The storm roared through the broken glass overhead. Sigils once hidden in the black dome now shone exposed along the ribs of the hall, old protective runes, long dormant, waking under moonlight and blood. The very chamber that had been meant to condemn her was turning into something stranger, older, less governable. Across the wreck of the floor, Malrek came toward them. He moved with terrible elegance, silver blade low, eyes bright with inherited hatred. "You wear her face badly," he said to Odette. Severin stepped between them. "Not another step," Malrek smiled. "You said that once before on the chapel stairs. Do you remember? Smoke in the rafters, her screaming your name." The cruelty was deliberate. It struck home. Odette felt the answer through the bond before Severin moved, a burst of pain so old it had long ago become instinct. Then the king attacked. They met in the center of the hall with a force that cracked stone. Malrek was quicker than Odette expected, his blade made for royal blood, each strike driving sparks where silver met black steel. Severin fought with no flourish at all. Every motion was economy, rage disciplined into lethal precision. He drove Malrek back one step, then another, toward the sundered dais. But Malrek was not trying to win by strength. He feinted, retreated, then cut not for Severin's throat, but for the half-buried binding bowl still shining amid broken marble. The blade struck silver. The vessel screamed. Odette doubled over as if the sound had entered her bones. The bond shuddered violently. Severin staggered. Malrek smiled, understanding at once. "There," he said. "You tied your life to hers so neatly." He struck the bowl again. Cracks webbed across its surface. Pain knifed through Odette's chest, across the silver seam where the bolt wound had healed. She caught herself against a fallen pillar, fighting for breath. Around her, the war in the hall receded into fragments. The world narrowed to the bowl, the bond, and Malrek's raised blade. Severin saw it too late. Malrek drove him to one knee with a silver slash across the side, then turned for the vessel a third time. Odette ran, no plan, no heroism. Only certain that if the bowl broke, the bond might tear them both apart. She threw herself between Malrek and the relic. His blade halted at her throat. For one suspended instant, all sound seemed to leave the hall. Malrek's eyes widened, not with pity but with contemptuous delight. "At last," he murmured. "A harrow stands where a veil once stood." Odette did not flinch. She was afraid, terribly. But beneath fear lay something steadier now, wrought in pain and truth, and the knowledge that running would only repeat the old ending. "If you mean to kill me," she said, her voice barely above the storm, "do it without pretending it is law." Malrek's mouth thinned. "You know nothing of law. I know it has hidden cowards behind sacred words for centuries." He raised the blade, and Severin spoke from the floor behind him. "Odette," his voice was quieter than the storm, yet it held her more surely than any shout. She turned her head. Blood darkened his side. One hand braced him upright. But it was not weakness in his face that made her heart stop. It was resolve stripped finally of all restraint, all compromise, all kingship except what remained when power and love ceased to be separable. "Close your eyes," he said. She did not. Malrek swung. Severin reached through the bond. It happened without touch. The half-mark at Odette's wrist blazed, so did his. A current of silver darkness surged between them. No spell spoken, no gesture learned, only the completed vow answering need. The force struck Malric full in the chest and hurled him backward across the shattered dais. He hit the cracked throne with a sound like stone breaking. The silver blade skidded away. The hall fell still. Malric tried to rise, could not. A black fissure had opened through his breast where the bond's power had struck, not like a wound of steel but of judgment. He stared at Odette with naked disbelief. That power, he said hoarsely, should not belong to her. Severin crossed the floor. Blood marked his path. Moonlight silvered the crown still on his brow. When he reached Malric, he did not strike at once. For centuries, he said, your house fed on fear and called it order. Malric coughed dark blood and laughed weakly. And yours fed on obedience. Yes. Severin's gaze flickered once, almost imperceptibly, toward Odette. No longer. He closed his hand around Malric's throat. The traitor lord looked past him then, not at the king but at Odette. He could not save the first one, he whispered. He will bury you too. Severin broke his neck. Silence returned with brutal suddenness. Across the ruined Hall of Judgment, the surviving nobles stared at their dead usurper, their broken dome, their awakened relic. And the mortal woman, still standing beside the bowl, no law had managed to destroy. Then Chancellor Valan, bleeding and exhausted, went to one knee before Odette and the king. One by one, others followed. Not all, but enough. The kingdom had split. And in the terrible stillness after battle, Odette realized the worst part had not yet begun. Now they would have to rule what remained. By dawn, the dead had been counted. By noon, the palace had learned the new shape of fear. And by evening, the kingdom waited to see whether its king would crown a mortal or bury her. Odette stood alone in the western chapel where the story had reopened. The old ruin had been partially restored through the day by silent hands. Broken stone cleared, candles relit. Seralda's portrait returned to its hidden recess, no longer concealed, but veiled in black silk. Rain moved softly over the battlements beyond. Her reflection in the chapel glass scarcely looked altered. She remained pale, grave, human. Only the mark at her wrist had changed. No longer a crescent, it had become a complete circle of silver thorns, delicate as a bracelet, impossible to remove. She touched it lightly. The bond answered at once with the distant certainty of Severin somewhere elsewhere in the palace, alive, wounded, enduring the endless demands of nobles suddenly eager to profess loyalty. She felt no words from him, only fatigue, resolve, and beneath both the same guarded care that had once hidden itself as indifference. The chapel door opened. Severin entered without escort. He had changed from blood-stained black into formal court dress, though he looked no less severe for it. The wound at his side slowed him slightly. Only someone bound to him would have noticed. For a moment neither spoke. Then he crossed to her and stopped at a distance that still honored the choice. "The council has spoken," he said, Odette's hands folded before her. "And 3 houses have fled, 2 remain undecided, the rest will accept what they can no longer prevent." She heard what lived beneath the diplomacy. Acceptance was not peace, not yet. "They want a ceremony," she said. "Yes, to calm the court, to bind the law to fact." A small, tired smile touched her mouth and was gone. Kings do love ceremony when truth becomes inconvenient. He almost smiled in return. Almost. Then the expression vanished, leaving only the quiet gravity that always seemed deepest in him when they were alone. "There is another choice," he said. "You may leave this palace before nightfall. I can give you escort, land under crown protection, more guards than any border prince commands. The bond will not break at distance. You would live. And you," he answered too quickly. "I will manage." Odette looked at him steadily until the lie failed under its own thinness. At last his gaze dropped. "I will endure it," not the same thing. She knew then that he had come prepared to let her go if it spared her the full cruelty of his world. The knowledge hurt her with almost exquisite tenderness. "For 3 years," she said quietly, You decided what danger I could survive. You hid me, denied me, kept away from me, all to spare me what had happened before. Yes, and did it spare me? His silence was answer enough. Rain whispered at the glass. Somewhere outside, bells prepared for evening rite. Odette stepped closer, not into his arms, not into anything dramatic, only close enough that the cold of him brushed the air between them. You told me once that neglect was a strategy, she said. I think it was grief. Something moved in his face then, something raw, stripped of all royal defense. Yes, he said. The word was almost soundless. She had imagined once that if he ever admitted such a thing she would feel triumph or relief. Instead, she felt sorrow for all that had been wasted in silence, and all that silence had cost them both. I cannot promise to be what Seralda was, she said. His reply came at once. I would never ask it. I cannot promise I will not be afraid. Neither can I, that startled a faint breath from her that might have been a laugh if the moment had been less solemn. The distance between them seemed suddenly very small. Severin lifted his hand slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, and touched the back of her wrist where the silver thorn circle lay. The contact sent a quiet shiver through the bond. Not hunger, not possession, only recognition settled at last into peace. I failed one woman I loved, because I believed the throne and the law were the same thing, he said. I will not fail you by making that mistake again. Odette heard the word loved and understood that it had been chosen deliberately. He had not offered her a comparison. He had offered her the truth of his own history, grave by grave. She answered with the only honesty she had. Then do not protect me by erasing me. His eyes closed briefly, as if the plea entered deeper than any wound. When he opened them, something in him had yielded for good. I swear it. The bells began, evening had come. The ceremony that followed was smaller than courts preferred and older than any surviving law. No public crown, no jeweled procession. Only the restored chapel, the silver bowl repaired though still cracked, Chancellor Valen as witness. And a handful of nobles brave enough, or wise enough, to stand present at the rewriting of their own age. Odette wore no bridal white, she wore midnight blue. Severin stood opposite her beneath the repaired arch where Seralda had once stood. For one terrible instant, as the candles guttered and rain moved outside, Odette felt the old history pressing near, ready to repeat itself. Then Severin held out his hand, not commandingly. Not even expectantly, simply open. She placed her hand in his. Their blood met in the restored bowl, not lavishly, not with spectacle, but enough. The vessel shone. The marks at their wrists answered in silver fire. Nothing broke. No doors burst open. No hunters came. The vow completed itself in silence. When it was done, the bond settled through her like a second heartbeat. Deeper now, gentler, irrevocable. Severin raised her hand, and this time when he bent over it, the touch of his mouth at her knuckles was not a courtly gesture. It was the first kiss he had ever given her. Brief, reverent. Unconcealed, Odette's breath caught. His eyes lifted to hers, dark and unguarded at last. Before midnight, he said softly, with a sadness that had finally made room for wonder, I only knew how to save you. The rain deepened outside. The candles shone over cracked stone, silver, and old grief laid finally to rest. And now, she whispered. His hand tightened around hers, not enough to bind, only enough to remain. Now, said the Vampire King, I must learn how to deserve you. Outside the chapel, the palace bells began to ring for the first queen the Covenant had not chosen. And far beneath the stones, where dead laws and dead women had waited together for centuries, the silence at last sounded like peace.